All right, I'm gonna get started.
Cool.
Welcome to the Ashtanga Discussion Podcast. I'm Peg Mulqueen, and today I'm here on Zoom, of course, with Mark Robberds, Oliver Crossley, and Scott White. Mark is a certified Ashtanga yoga teacher and movement specialist, and Ollie and Scott are both physiotherapists and yoga practitioners who use yoga therapy in their work. The three connected over Instagram over a shared interest in movement and yoga, particularly in the realm outside of dogma. And something that bugged all three of them were these unfounded stories that get continually passed around about yoga and movement. And so they formed the Mythbusters in an effort to educate and clarify some of those pesky myths. And thank you guys for being here and doing this with us. And we are gonna debunk, or you guys are gonna debunk some of these myths, or maybe you're gonna tell me their truth. I don't know. Maybe I think they're myths and you're gonna tell me otherwise. But I thought it was really cute. When I first saw your first post on knees over toes, I thought that was awesome. And then the second one about language and how we have to be careful about the stories that we pass on. And you used specifically Trikonasana causes hip problems. And I've heard that one, totally have heard that one. So was really, really happy that you guys tackled that as well. So, okay. Are you ready to tackle some myths?
Sure am.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. First up, this is one I hear a lot, and particularly when we're talking about twisting postures. Keep your hips squared. And by hips, I think they mean pelvis too. So keep hips and pelvis square. Truth or myth? Mark, how about you start?
Okay, so before I go into the details of that one, I just want to just get people to start thinking about a few questions, like why, and then who and what. Okay, so whether it be Trikonasana, any pose, and the instructions that we give, why are we giving those instructions? Okay, and who is the person that we're giving them to? And then, what is the exercise of instruction being done? So for this one, if the idea, say the why might be, we want to keep the rotation in the thoracic spine. Okay, so then you want to keep the hips square so that there's no compensation pattern happening through the pelvis. Okay, so that might be the why. But you have to look at who the person is that you're giving this instruction to. So for example, in Pavarita Trikonasana, if that person doesn't have the hamstring flexibility to reach the floor, or even the arm length to reach the floor without having to compensate somewhere, then maybe they would have to turn the pelvis to get that rotation. Okay, so that would be addressing who is the person you're giving instruction to. So the point is that one instruction, keep the hips square, might not be suitable for everybody. It might be a great instruction for some people, but it might be a terrible instruction for others. Okay, so that would be my sort of answer to that. And then in terms of a functional level, if you were out on the street or in the forest or something, and you heard a noise behind you, and you had to turn to see where that noise is coming from, you wouldn't be thinking, keep your hips square. You would just rotate your whole body, right? So that's what we've also got to remember as well. It's these yoga poses are very specific, and they're in the sense, I might upset some people when I say this, but they're kind of made up. Somebody decided that, okay, let's make this pose and we're going to make these rules and then we stick to them. But, it's just they're the rules of the game, and then you are allowed to break the rules once you understand what those are. So that's my answer. Yeah.
I like that. Ollie,
Okay.
you got anything to add to that?
No, Mark, in his usual style, has summarized things perfectly. but that's his wealth of practice and experience. So yeah, I think the why, what, who, that's perfect. Yeah, I'll probably pass it on to Scott, who's smarter than me.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but thank you for the endorsement, Ollie. But it's inaccurate. Yeah, like I think my experience with this coming from an Iyengar background, and I know we've all practiced a little bit of Iyengar and dabbled in that world. So with Parabita Trikonasana, for example, the instruction is pretty clear, and the technique is really taught quite precisely. And I think maybe some of this confusion arises because people have been blending methods a little bit. So the emphasis, so the why, I think in that style of practice is on a really precise way of getting into the pose and holding it for a long period of time, longer than say in Ashtanga sometimes. And so I've found that if you keep the pelvis square in Parabita Trikonasana, then like Mark suggested, it emphasizes more hamstring lengthening, particularly the lateral hamstrings. But if you're practicing more of a vinyasa practice, and maybe the emphasis is different there, maybe it's more on the flow of the practice and focusing on the breathing and on your drishti, and maybe you already have quite long hamstrings, and therefore you don't really need to focus on trying to lengthen the lateral hamstrings. So that why is no longer relevant for that individual, and they can get into the pose okay, and their pelvis might be a little bit twisted, but it doesn't really matter for them. And sometimes, again, back to the language thing that you said at the start about our post that we did on language. Sometimes the language can get a bit dodgy around these instructions too, and it can relate to, well, if you don't square your pelvis, you'll damage something, you'll hurt your hamstring or something. And that, as a blanket rule, it is not a good way of communicating, because everyone's different and all individuals are going to be approaching with a different body type at a different stage in their life, and plus the yoga practice that they're doing might emphasize different things. And when people are blending different styles together and they go to one workshop here and another workshop here, then they get confused. And I think that's why these myths are around, because there is not a consistency with what we call yoga. There's so many different schools and different people, and so yeah, black and white rules like that, always keep the pelvis square, become problematic because of the diversity of people and the diversity of styles. That would be my kind of answer there.
Yeah.
You brought up a good point. You said something really relevant, and you said the blending of styles. And I was realizing that in Iyengar yoga, you would put a block under someone's hand. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if they didn't have the length, then yeah.
And that would change it. So then keeping a block under someone's hand would take the hamstring element out of it, right? It would make it more appropriate for them. But if you don't have a block and you try to keep your hips squared and bring your hand to the floor, bring it flat, as you know we would do in Ashtanga, then that would be yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's exactly it. So if your goal is to reach the floor and you don't quite have the hamstring length and you rotate the pelvis, then you will reach the floor. But if your goal is lengthening the hamstrings and you don't quite have the hamstring length, then you keep the pelvis square and you can put the hand on the block, and then that's okay. And so I think, yeah, there's sometimes there's just a little bit of misunderstanding there about when to apply these instructions. Yeah.
And I just remembered a story of when I was teaching like many years ago, and I had this idea of the hips have to be square, and one of my students, who was actually older than me, he hadn't been practicing as long as me, but he was senior to me, so like I respected his opinion and his what his knowledge of his body, and I tried to adjust him, saying keep your hips square, because he was like doing that classic thing where the hip was going like right out to the side. And I was thinking he was doing it incorrectly, but then he just turned to me and said, I'm trying to stretch the outside of my hip, and that actually, if you've ever tried that, it actually does do that in that posture. If you let your hip go outside the line of the heel, you get a nice stretch through the outer hip. So I think we're all guilty of that to some degree, of like, we kind of get locked into these ideas of how the posture should look. And then we don't allow for students to have their own, experimentation, looking for their own lines of tension, their own lines of where the stretch feels good. And, I think in 2020, we're finally coming to the understanding that we need to start to listen more to what our students are telling us and not trying to impose our rules and our ideas and dogmas upon everybody.
I
So
think that was a good point, Mark, especially when you mentioned the seniority, because I think the instructions get passed down often from people who are in a position of seniority, or they have a certification if it's Ashtanga, or they'll be a certain level in the Iyengar system. Yeah. And I remember my teacher telling me that every year, he or another teacher that he would work with would go to India, and they would spend a couple of months with Iyengar, and this is back in the 80s. And they would come back and they would be like, okay, this is how you do Trikonasana, or this is how you do this pose. Then the next year they'd come back and like, no, it's this way. And he was like, what Iyengar was doing, he was just playing around with it, and he was trying different things. But we get lost in the instruction, thinking that it must be like it becomes a dogma rather than a reflection of, well, actually Iyengar was just innovating, and he was being creative, and he was playing around with his body. And I think that's what we should take from it. And so sometimes it just gets lost in translation,
Yeah, squared hips are so hot right now. But what is it with that? That's something I find that's interesting in the yoga tradition. I want to put this back to all of you, to Peg, Mark, and Scott. Is what I'm finding really interesting is this tension between curiosity, variety, play perhaps, and experimentation. And maybe it's the classic tension between conservatism and progressivism, if that's a word, but then coming back and more keeping things the same and trying to control it and just do what we know and don't change it. Seems to be merits to both, but I've just kind of been confused by the war between them in the yoga world.
Yeah.
The paradox.
We found one.
Too. It's...
No, I've had,
Go on.
I want to just add something to that, Ollie. Yeah, I've had, that experience before COVID, for the last workshop I taught, because, I attract, I guess, a crowd now that sees my Instagram posts or whatever and sees, oh, this guy's really open-minded, he's experimenting, he's trying all these different things. Okay, so then, I'm also attracting a certain element of people who think that they're just going to come to my Mysore style class and just do whatever the hell they want, right? And then I find myself in this kind of conundrum. It's like, oh my God, what have I created? I've created a monster. And, because I can see that actually the students who do really well in a Mysore class are the ones who have learnt the traditional method, really know the vinyasa, they've got the good concentration, and they really understand the progressive nature of the practice of learning one pose at a time and not just doing things, willy-nilly. So it's what you were pointing towards there, Oliver. It's this, this pressure between those opposing sort of approaches. And so that's kind of where, last workshop, I realized I need to now try to find a balance between the two in the way that I'm presenting it and how I want, the students to approach it as well.
I like what you said in the very beginning when you said the why. And I think if you ask that question, why do we practice Mysore style, or why are we doing it this way? And looking for the experiential component, it feels like then you can individualize, then you can kind of accommodate the paradox. And and I think
100%.
that's wonderful. I think anytime we go too far in one direction or the other, that's always one, but one that I can't find the why for, and maybe
Yeah.
y'all can help me. No pain, no gain. No pain, no gain. That's one that gets passed around certainly in yoga, but also in myriad of other disciplines and areas. So, Ali, what do you think? No pain, no gain.
No pain, no gain. It's definitely flawed because I mean, like anything with dogma, it gets problematic, but it's a straw. I was just thinking, and it's almost like a single blinder straw telescope looking into this big universe that is movement practice, yoga practice, and pain. Because pain can come about, as Scott has helped me understand a lot in the last few years, in an individual very differently to another individual. So whereas pain might be something that someone needs to work through within reason in an asana practice, for someone else, it's very wise and maybe helpful to just not even go near it. So it's about, again, probably understanding the individual and their context, particularly now that we know that pain arises from a variety of causal factors, not just physical, structural stimulus response things, but if your social environment and psychological environment is filled with stress and threat and trauma, then you're more likely to experience pain than someone who has the exact same body and the exact same tissues. So looking at understanding the individual would be the primary step there. You guys?
Yeah, the way that I've thought about that little phrase is to view a spectrum where you have over on the left-hand side of the spectrum, you have people who are really fear avoidant about pain. So extreme fear avoidance, which leads people to become less and less trusting in their body and avoiding all kinds of stimulus that, minor pain stimulus might lead someone to become narrower and narrower and narrower in the movements that they are willing to try. And in persistent pain, this becomes a real problem when, and this is quite a broad topic, so we could talk about pain science and that sort of thing for hours, but to try and narrow it down, when people have had pain that has gone on for quite some time, sometimes they can be scared of that pain, and they often will equate movement with pain, and they're equating that pain with tissue damage. They're thinking that when they move, they're making their bodies structurally, causing some sort of structural damage to their bodies. And so that over there on the left, this no pain, no gain thing, what we're trying to do is to get people to begin to reconceptualize what that pain means and how to interpret that. And so when you're rehabilitating people who are very fear avoidant, scared of going into pain, there's this process of, and I guess you would say, moving them into positions where they may feel uncomfortable, but providing a safe, reassuring environment for them, where they can start to be a bit more mindful of the sensation that they're experiencing, recognize that it's not going to make them worse and it isn't going to make them sore. Approach that's called graduated exposure. So if you gradually expose someone to positions or stimulus that they feel uncomfortable in, gradually they can start to increase the scope of their movement. And so this is how you rehabilitate someone who's quite disabled with pain, but that's over there on the extreme. On the other side of the spectrum, then you have maybe like a very healthy, fit person who goes to a master class, but they're a little bit reckless and they're in a pose that their body isn't quite ready for, say, and they haven't done that progressive overload. They haven't allowed enough time for their body to adapt to the new stimulus, and they apply a force that exceeds the tissue bearing capabilities, and then they'll actually injure themselves. So on that side of the spectrum, someone is experiencing some pain, and that's when that little dogma, no pain, no gain, will cause them harm, because they might actually, exceed the tissue bearing capabilities in the pose, and they might hurt themselves in whatever pose you might, some sort of lotus pose, which is common, pushing too hard. Maybe they're not ready for that yet. So I think what we need to do is, if you want to think about that phrase, no pain, no gain, is to maybe be somewhere in the middle where we're not completely avoiding discomfort, but we're also not pushing too far. You want to be able to experience some, I would say, feeling of discomfort in the practice, and recognize it's not a bad thing. Know when you're pushing too far, but also know when you're being too fear avoidant and experiencing a little bit of discomfort and saying, no, I'm just going to not do that pose ever again because it's going to make me sore. So it's an unuseful phrase because it doesn't appreciate the nuance of where people are sitting on that spectrum. I hope that made sense.
So what I
Perfect.
hear you saying, though, is you differentiated between pain and discomfort, and that maybe we confuse sensation for pain on one end of the spectrum, and that would be certainly one area. And I would see in therapeutic work where we kind of have to work in that area so that you can make things. And then pain, on the other hand, I have many students say to me, it shouldn't feel easy. Nothing should feel easy or good. Then I'm not working hard enough. So there's this kind of hooked on sensation, the hooked on extreme sensation, which leads to pain. And that's where I think that no pain, no gain, you got to like really push it, work hard. And I don't know, maybe Mark, what do you think?
Yeah.
Well, I think Scott summed it up pretty well. I'll just give my own example of how I deal with pain. So like right now I've got this left shoulder thing, which is just been bugging me for a while. So I just have to, like, if I'm raising my arm overhead, it's one of those ones where if I take my arm out to the side, it just hurts. And I know that if I go into that pain, it's not going to get better. So the way I get around it is I try to do the things that I can do without pain. So I'm continuing to do those. And then, as Scott mentioned, this idea of gradual exposure or graduated exposure, to start exposing my shoulder to the movements that are uncomfortable, but with a very light load. So, for example, maybe I'm just using no weight, or maybe I'm using like a 1 kilogram dumbbell or 2 kilogram dumbbell or resistance band or whatever. And just gradually, I'm going to get that tissue, the shoulder, so it can feel safe doing that movement again, and then gradually try to build it back up. Same with my knee. Yeah, I have a similar thing with my right knee, patella. I have a bit of pain there when I'm bending it. So I just know that, like, if I do too much, like squatting type movements, knees over toes, for example, it might feel sensitive the next day. So I just monitor that and just see, okay, yeah, it's a little sensitive, but then it's recovering pretty quickly. So I know that I can maybe push it a little bit more the next time.
Mark makes a good point there about recovery. That's probably the biggest thing where no pain, no gain can be delineated, is like the person's capacity for feeling that, but also noticing it the next day and being receptive to the body. We call it like auto-regulation. So like now when I get on the mat, instead of this Ashtanga rigidity, it's going, oh, well, I did more of this yesterday, so I'll vary the postures today or change the pace or do half a practice or less. Or it's about kind of just good programming, which comes, I mean, the strength and conditioning world knows so well, but in the yoga world, we are so smart in so many ways, but when we prescribe movement, it's kind of a bit all or nothing.
I think that's true. The all or nothing. You know, I've always used as like my indicator to not that maybe what I was doing wasn't helpful. I mean, if I feel pain, for example, there was an instruction that was given recently in a class and it wasn't feeling good on my shoulder. Like I felt the pain. And in that moment, I had to make a decision. Do I continue doing this movement? And it was nothing with the teachers. Like, I don't assume that what the teacher's cue is, whatever way my body was interpreting it or playing it out wasn't working, and it felt painful. And it was weird because in that moment, I thought, I need to just do it because that's what they're instructing, right? But I could feel the pain. And at the moment, I just thought, you know what? Whatever I'm doing is clearly not working for me. And it probably has nothing to do with what they're saying, but the way I'm interpreting it, let me back away and come into it slower. But I always feel like pain is my indicator to, like, and I'm talking about pain, so not discomfort, but actual, and maybe you guys can help me define what pain is. What is pain to you? Because pain to me is sharp, hard, that's pain. But pain is different to different people. What's your definition?
Oh, yeah.
Scott, do we tell them about the International Association for the Society of Pain trying to define it?
Yeah, well, that's it. So Ollie brings up a point. So each year they'll try and redefine pain, and some of this term changes, and it'll be like, oh, I can't remember what the current incarnation is. It's something like an unpleasant sensory stimulus that may or may not be associated with tissue damage. So I think the may or may not be associated with tissue damage is the important thing, because we can experience pain that is completely uncoupled from any damage that might be occurring in our body. And it might be very excruciating discomfort, but there might not be, it may not correlate with, and we've all experienced this to a certain extent. So, say if you graze your skin, then the sensation, because of the nociceptors on the skin, that can be really intense, but you've barely hurt yourself. Or like a paper cut is a similar example to that. Whereas someone might be going into myocardial infarction, i.e. having a heart attack, where there's genuine tissue damage, and they might really feel very little pain at all, but before you know it, they're in theatre being operated on. So and this inconsistency between the state of the tissues and the subjective experience of pain has been observed for many years. There was some famous studies on this back after World War II, when they brought people injured in from the battlefield who had horrific wounds but reported very little pain. And when they were asked about their subjective state of mind, it was revealed that they were mostly overjoyed from being removed from battle and being able to go back home to be with their families. So they had huge tissue damage and no pain. And then there are other instances where someone might be working in a stressful environment, or perhaps doing a yoga pose in a class, and they have all sorts of other psychosocial stresses going on, and they feel a twinge in their back, and it becomes catastrophized, and it becomes really debilitatingly sore. But you scan them, you look up and down, and there's no observable tissue damage. But the subjective sensation of suffering can be quite dramatic. So understanding this world, and there've been many studies done on this area where you just manipulate the environment a little bit, and someone will feel much more pain or much less pain, just depending on the circumstance or the cues that are given. So more threatening cues will tend to invoke more pain, less threatening cues invoke less pain. So this is why the language is important. I'll try to wrap this up. So for instance, if I were to give you a stimulus peg, right? So just imagine this: you close your eyes, and I place a metal coin on the back of your hand, and you don't know what that stimulus is, but the coin has been in a really cold storage room where it's like -40 degrees, and I place that on your skin, right? So it's really cold. But you don't know what that sense, you don't know what I've just done. I've just put something on you. You're getting this really intense prickly sensation in your skin. So at -40, you're not really going to experience much tissue damage if it's on there for a small period of time. Now, if you were to open your eyes and there's a screen in front of you that says cold, or even if it just has a blue screen with no word on it, you'll experience that pain on average at about 2 out of 10. But if the screen is red or the screen has the word hot on it, on average, your pain unpleasantness score will be about 8 out of 10. And the stimulus is exactly the same. It's negative 40 degrees. But that differential is about 6 degrees on a 10 out on pain score up to 10. So the same thing can occur in a yoga class. Someone experiences that little bit of back pain, if they're doing a back bend, Kapotasana or whatever. Someone says, oh, you probably herniated your disc, and that is because you've got disc degeneration from all those years of doing back bends. And Michael Bulb, he's in a wheelchair now because he did too many back bends, and that's one stimulus. That's like the red stimulus. Whereas if you say, oh, it's just a muscle spasm, you just need to back off your practice for a little bit, maybe do some other poses, rest, stretch out the area in different ways, and come back to it and you'll be fine. That stimulus will be registered by the brain at a much lower level because of this idea of perceived threat. So it's an evolutionary, almost like a reflexive way that our brain produces an experience. And that experience depends on context. So when it comes to pain, it's very complex in that regard. Okay, now tell me where that made sense and where that didn't, Peg.
But I still hear you say moving away. I mean, like, yeah, no, that was the mind definitely interprets the pain, and you're sitting there in that moment trying to decide, is this me? Do I need, like, I mean, when you feel something like that, I hear you trying to diffuse the sensation of pain with words, and like, you don't want to catastrophize and make someone panic, because that obviously will create more pain in the body. But still, what I'm wondering though is, then how does a student know? Because this almost feels like we need to go into it, and it could be your mind. I mean, this could perpetuate that idea that it's all in your head, and what do you do? I'm asking legit.
Yeah, I'll let Ollie jump in a sec too, because I'm sure he has some ideas on this, and then Mark as well. So it is a bit of a balancing act, and it's a very delicate conversation that you want to have with that person. So, I mean, in the physiotherapy world, you would screen that person for any signs of any serious damage, but there is like a little bit of, you really need to have a good relationship with the person. You need to know their body type, I think. You need to know what their history is, know what sort of background they have going on in their lives. Does this pain correlate with an area of heightened stress in their life? Now, if you know your students quite well and you're able to have those conversations with them outside of the shala, or in the physiotherapy world, we'll tend to do a long subjective, so we get to know where someone's at in their life. And if look, I haven't had any pain, I've been doing this pose exactly the same every day, and now it's suddenly sore and I can't really figure out why. And then you figure out that their business is getting sued, they've just gone through a divorce, and there's a whole having of other stuff, their house is having forced to get sold or whatever. And then you're like, right, can you maybe correlate this heightened level of stress is causing this massive muscle guarding tissue sensitivity that it maybe correlates with that. So the instructions still might be to back off and take it easy, but you've delivered the information in a way that recognizes the psychology of it and doesn't buy into this idea that they've done tissue damage, or that they've hurt themselves, or that there's a biological explanation for their pain. On the other side of the spectrum, maybe you look at it, the knee's really swollen, it's red, it's got fluid on it. You heard a massive popping sound when they tried to get into Padmasana. That's probably more like genuine tissue damage at that point. But the same rule would apply. You would advise them to back off and continue to work on it. And with knee pain, you can rehabilitate, meniscus tears and even ACL tears, we know now, with conservative treatment. So you can still de-threaten them while appreciating the underlying cause, which might either be biological, or it might have more of psychological component. It's always both, though. And it's weighted differently depending on the individual. So in my experience, knowing the student is really important, and being able to have a good relationship with them. If you don't know them from a bar of soap, it's kind of hard to have that conversation. And maybe you want to err on the side of caution in that instance when you don't know them. Yeah, it's tricky, right?
Well, I think
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
I think what I hear you saying, psychological pain can manifest in the body, physical pain can manifest in the body, and they can both manifest in similar ways, and it doesn't necessarily equate to injury or injurious things. And in both cases, you're saying we're going to ease out of that. I think the idea is that people think if you don't feel that, like even with stress, you brought up psychological, like people think, well, if I'm not working hard, if I'm not really like we're a little addicted to busyness and that we have to be running on 99% to really be effective. But let me let you guys jump in here, because maybe I'm taking this off into another tangent. But this whole idea of no pain, no gain is this idea that you have to feel pain, you have to go into it to actually make progress.
Yeah, I go to a quote from one of my favorite like scientists and people on earth, Lorimer Moseley, where he just says, pain is your friend. And in every person, pain is real, and it's real to them. And that meaning and realness might be different to everyone else. So it's always worth listening to. So generally with what you're saying, Peg, which completely makes sense, it is about backing off, but it's a individual decision that they should be empowered to make, as long as it's in line with what's important to them. And that's probably where Scott comes in and goes, you need to just make sure you know a little bit about them. But if you don't, it's just about validating their experience. But then in terms of what I'm interested in is where it's difficult to scientifically explore some of the more subtle aspects of yoga practice, where some narratives and processes can be explained in ways that can be very easily hijacked or ruined. That pain is just the nervous system being cleansed in second series. And so with people like yourself, Mark and Peg, who've had like an extensive Ashtanga practice history, what's your experience of the subtle stuff and pain?
Mark, I'm gonna let you go.
Yeah. Well, I just want to first add, just like from the FRC, the functional range conditioning system, which, that I've been applying also to my teaching and practice. One of their main things that they say is like, pain is the most limiting factor to movement. So they have an expression, closing angle pinching. And basically this indicates aberrant joint function. So for an example of that would be like, if I'm doing a neck circle and I start going like this, you guys can see me, but the listeners won't be able to see me, will they? Or is this going to be on YouTube?
I'm going to do clips probably. So yeah, maybe this part would be, go ahead.
So if you're listening to this, just imagine like you're doing a neck circle and you're rotating towards your left shoulder. So if you are feeling pain as you rotate to the left, that's the side that's shortening, and the other side is opening. Okay, so if you're feeling an opening, like a stretching sensation on the right side, generally they would say that's what you want to feel. But if you're feeling pain or a pinching, we all know that sort of pinching sensation in a joint, in your neck or in your shoulder. You feel that if you're doing an arm-shoulder rotation, and you feel that pinching sensation in the shoulder, then this is indicating aberrant joint function, and we don't want to go into that. We don't want to push into that pain. We want to make the circle smaller or move away, do rotations away from that pain. So for in the example of the neck, if you are feeling pain going to the left side, then do rotations to the right side. Or do smaller circles until your body starts to adapt, and then you can slowly start to make the circles bigger. So I think that's, from a movement perspective, if you're feeling joint pain on the closing angle, then you don't want to push into that.
Mm.
Yep.
Okay, and then from this, the other thing that Ollie brought up, the psychological thing, like over the years, I've had all those sorts of things. I've heard all those sorts of things. And I mean, of course, the body-mind connection is real. I totally understand that. But sometimes it can go a little bit too far, and there can be a kind of like a shaming that goes on, right? So one time I got a back spasm, kind of put my back out. And then I remember somebody saying, "Oh, that's because you're feeling unsupported in your life."
Oh my God.
Or, someone hurts their knee, and then, okay, that's just about ego and control or whatever, So sometimes it can go too far with trying to put these, psycho, spiritual meanings to everything.
Well, interestingly, before I was in yoga, I was a counselor. So that's where my training is, not necessarily body, but mind. But what I think is, I was just hearing you and thinking the biggest pain in the mind is fear. And one of the therapeutic techniques when you're dealing with fear is, like, say somebody's afraid of heights, right? And they can't drive over a bridge. You don't want to just say, you need to drive over the bridge, like, just do it. You got to feel it, and you got to feel that fear. It's like you first start off imagining the bridge, driving over it, and just like close your eyes. You're nowhere near a bridge, right? Or then you start to observe it. Anyway, you do it very, very slowly and supported. And so that and I think this goes back to something Scott was saying, you're easing into it so that you don't want to feel that huge sensation. And so certainly the mind does influence the body, but as Mark, you also said, the body is the body, and it's not necessarily just a metaphor of, and I love that when people say that, they're usually not trained counselors. They're just,
It's just something they heard.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Anyone else have anything to add with the no pain, no gain?
Maybe just, doubling up on what Mark was saying there. So, because Iyengar actually wrote some fairly interesting things on pain as well, and he spoke about this in some of his lectures that he did. So when I got into yoga practice from having persistent pain for myself for about 2 years, which was very debilitating. I could barely walk without a visible limp for about 18 months. And so when I started practicing, I was quite uncomfortable, and I did need to get myself into positions that, and I guess you would maybe describe the sensations as painful. I mean, they were uncomfortable. If I never exposed myself to that discomfort or that pain, then I would have been stuck in this spiral, this fear avoidant little cotton wool basket forever. For me, there was definitely a lot of fear avoidance, and maybe because of the information that I was given about my pelvis, and this is another myth, I was told that I had pelvic instability, and told that I needed to have my pelvis fused surgically. I was given these SIJ belts that I'd wrap around myself, and
probably weren't keeping it straight. You probably weren't keeping it straight.
So I had all these unhelpful beliefs that I'd been fed that exacerbated these stimulus, and so I'd get into a pose like Trikonasana, and this sensation, and I wouldn't even be able to move. I'd just rotate my foot to the side slightly to get into the pose, and just a little bit of sidening, and the intensity of the stretch in my adductors was really, really strong. But at that point, I think your mind has to be able to make a discrimination between these two different types of quote-unquote pain. One is this really strong, intense feeling, and the other is something that, like Mark said, just doesn't feel quite right. It's like more of a sharp, twinging thing where maybe you really just are in a good physiological position, not optimal, and you can just move your hips slightly, and then it feels better. And then you're articulating a little bit more nicely, and you can lengthen the muscle tissue, and you're not provoking any unnecessary discomfort. So when we're talking about pain science, I think it's important not to take it too far and just assume that everything's good and it's all psychosocial, and that there are no better ways of moving. Like sometimes there just are better ways of moving and less efficient ways of moving too. So there is sometimes, you know, technique is good. And sometimes we can be too rigid with our rules and say the hips always need to be square. So my experience with that was finding that balance where I was like, okay, I'm going to get into a pose and I'm going to feel some discomfort, but it just feels like a good, healthy kind of discomfort. And then I'd go too far, I'd be in the wrong position, I'd be like, oh, that feels like a twinge and that's dodgy. And that's when I know I need to back off a little bit. And I think you can have those. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think what you just said is right. Like it's getting to know your own body. And when we perpetuate the myth of no pain, no gain, I think it has students or anybody disregard the sensation. When you have that myth, that saying out there, that language, no pain, no gain, you start to feel that, and it doesn't give you the ability to kind of go into it and decide, is this a sharp, pain that is wrong, or am I feeling sensation? Is that what's coming up? When we say no pain, no gain, it doesn't matter which one it is, you go into it. And I think, so that's where kind of like, I think what you're saying is being able to go into that and kind of make those decisions. I think I hear all three of you saying that's something that needs to be thoughtful. And I do like that way that you, Mark, that you said, I like the way you differentiated the two in the joint and the muscular, because I think that's those two I think that's really clear. I think we all know what sharp, pinching, that kind of pain feels like. Unfortunately, I do know what that feels like. And to answer your question, Ollie, about the subtle systems, I think that's why we practice, right? I mean, Mark, you can say what you think, but I think that there is some psychological stress for me in second. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. There definitely was, and it definitely manifested in what I would say felt physical, because it was. And I think what it helped me do was to learn to regulate my nervous system by going through it slowly. So instead of going fast again into it, I simply slowed up and to regulate my nervous system. And I think that consequently, it might have taken me a while. It wasn't quick, but it grew my capacity to regulate what maybe we're calling sensation or physical manifestation of what I would interpret as, it certainly felt pain. I certainly was suffering. How's that? Like, I wouldn't have called it pain, but I definitely would not have said that it was enjoyable or felt good. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next one. And Ollie, I'm going to actually start with you. Let's talk about practice, and everything's possible. Like, that's all it takes. That's all anything takes is practice. So no matter what it is, if you just practice enough, you can do it. True or false?
I'm going to lean towards false with a little bit of true sprinkled on top.
It's all about the nuance.
Yeah, we're like trying to pin down a politician. So no, but yes. But like, for example, I see this a little bit. Like, I've seen some people particularly who have hip joints that are slightly more anteverted or retroverted. So what that means is their legs tend to look like they're more internally rotated versus they're more externally rotated. So you'll see, people who tend to have a bit of a duck walk versus toes in a bit. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how they're built, which is awesome. But that they'll have a bit of a tougher time with some poses than others. I have a bit more tissue around my lower limbs and pelvis. So certain ranges of motion, like hip extension, are a bit tight. And I've been working it with strength drills and stuff for years, and they're only just starting to open up. So it's, in most of the time, you can train your body to get to do amazing things. But the problem with most people is life's more than just how much hip extension do I have. It's family, it's kids, it's community. And so it takes a lot of time to do this stuff. And really it comes down to, what's valuable, what's important to you. So mostly false, yeah, but and it's healthy to respect the limitations of the human, and more important to remember what's important for them. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was pretty helpful. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think, are you talking about like this, sometimes in the yoga world, there's this kind of message pervade that like, look, I was nothing and then I've reached the top and therefore look at me, and if I can do it, you can do it. Basically, that's what the message is often portrayed. So I think there's, it's a limited, to put it bluntly, genetics plays a role. You know, if we're thinking about yoga, if the asana side of things, okay, like, you know, we all know yoga is more than asana, and it's much more than that. So let's just put that aside for a moment, just talk about the physical capacity of the human body. Then genetics definitely plays a role, but then so does hard work as well. So, you know, you do need to apply yourself. There's definitely, I mean, practice is so important. Like, it's all about practice as well. That's true. But we shouldn't give like unrealistic expectations. There's, you know, like when it comes to like, one often I see is like the jump back, jump through, for example. You know, some people just have it naturally. They just are gifted. You know, either they've got the long limbs or they've got the short legs, or they've got kind of like this very kaffa type, this flexible type body. You know, so it's just, I think of, you know, selling like a false hope sometimes to just make people think that everybody's going to be able to do it like the best of them just by practice alone. So, but at the same time, I always tell this story, which was like when I think it was 99 or 2000, I expressed to my yoga teacher that I wanted to learn to teach. And he said to me, well, you don't really have the body type for yoga, so maybe, you know, put that one on the back burner and pursue something else. But I just put that down to, he kind of misread actually my body type. And also he didn't see like the determination that I had, that I was going to go into this thing full on and practice and learn as much as I could, you know? So there's, I think it comes down to like and we've been saying for all of these things, there's no one size fits all. And there's like this spectrum of, you know, possibilities when we start thinking about what is possible.
Scott, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that was well put, Mark. This has been my observation of what sometimes happens in these schools, is that you'll get, say, so, like Mark said, someone who will say, look, you know, I started from nothing and now look where I am, and they become certified and they start running their little shala, and that myth then, you know, just practice and all is coming, you don't even need to do anything outside of the practice, just focus on the series, and, you know, don't skip poses. I didn't skip poses, rah. So that becomes the little mantra. So for some people that mantra may actually be helpful if they do have the genetics, and it just by pure accident, they just happen to, that sequence just works. The whole way the series is structured in Ashtanga just works for that person, kind of like a lottery. And thinking that that's a myth might actually be unhelpful for them, because then they're like, no, like the dogma to a certain extent can sometimes carry someone. But the problem is the lack of generalizability of that. And what can happen in these studios sometimes is you have these two cognitive biases that come into play, and one would be the survivorship bias and the other would be confirmation bias. So if you have a survivorship bias, and if you guys are not familiar with that, that's, you know, this bias that because you experienced a certain thing, then that should be generalized with everyone else. And then the confirmation bias is that they'll have this narrative running, and the students that come along and do really well will stick around. And the students that come and they just get stuck on Ashtanga D for 6 months and they never get past, you know, a few poses into the primary series, they get bored, they get frustrated, maybe they hurt themselves. They go away and they never come back, and you never remember them. And so you're only remembering the people who are doing really well. And so then all the students just have the same body type as the teacher, and they all look like carbon copies of each other. And other people are coming in and they get fed that same narrative, that same myth. Just practice and always coming in. Maybe that person needs to do some extra stuff outside the practice. Maybe it needs to be changed. Maybe some poses are just not appropriate for that person. I mean, there's obvious examples. Someone might be pregnant, or they might be an amputee or whatever, you know, like extreme examples like that. Or they might just have a body type that, like Ollie says, is maybe more internally rotated in the hips. And they really are going to get stuck on certain poses, and may take years to get anywhere with the practice if they're just doing Surya Namaskar A, B, and standing poses, and then they're just jumping straight into half lotus. That might be a bit of a problem for them. So, yeah, like Ollie said, mostly a myth, but then sprinkled on top, there's going to be some people to whom that just seems to work, and that's why they've, you know, got so far in the practice. But it's more by accident than design. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. And I really like that confirmation and survivor bias. That really puts some context to the way that's passed on. I was thinking about two experiences that I have had definitely in my own life when it comes to practice. And I thought I think it was like a few weeks ago, I posted on one of my stories, like, what's the secret to getting your leg behind your head? And like, if I'm sitting and I just bend my knee comes clear up to my shoulder. Like, yeah, like, that's a really big, like, that's really helpful in getting your leg back there. But if your knee comes below,
I'm the same. Look at that.
Like, oh God, you're even. So I mean, yeah, having long legs and a short torso really helpful. Like and so that's not something. And I've worked with people that their knee has come way down, and even binding, like down below. Like, I have one person I know who's like right at the lower level of their rib cage where their knee comes.
Yeah.
I just like
reach out in the sea. It's a nightmare.
Oh God, it's like, and so you're gonna stay there forever? Like, is that? Yes, everything is. I guess possible. I don't know what's possible, and I don't know what's not possible. But I do know, like, I think what you were saying, Scott, that it's like probably not going. I mean, you know, how many years, or Ollie, when you said how many years you want to spend, you know, working on binding and Marichyasana C and that. But then I also
Richard Freeman suggested to put, like, you know, on the roadside, the witches' hats. So you just pop one of those on top of the knee, and then you can bind.
Love that. I love that. He's awesome. And then I had somebody say to me, though, when I was working in third series, somebody said, your window is closing. You need to finish this now because, and I was getting ready. I was in my late 40s at that point. And so that idea that once you turn 50, it's over. You can't progress. Yeah. It all goes downhill after that. I'm 54 now. But it took a little while for that mindset. You guys talked about language, for those words, the residue it left for years after were tough and encouraging.
Yeah.
So
I've seen people start Ashtanga in their 50s and absolutely thrive. So, and they're kind of a rare case, but it's generally because they've got a sort of a proclivity to the practice. They have a body type that really responds well to it, and they've got that enthusiasm of a 20-year-old. and they thrive on it. Whereas what I've found normally is people who usually approaching 50, they've maybe been practicing for up to 20, 30 years or whatever, and that enthusiasm is starting to go into a downhill, right? So that is, I kind of feel like that's probably more of an influencing factor.
Yeah, Mark, remember like years ago when you came to Townsville, there was a man there, and I'm pretty sure he was in his mid-70s when he started, maybe early 70s. Frank. Yes.
Yeah.
Now he can lift his grandkids over his head, and he still does real estate. It's amazing. I think he's 80 now.
Yeah, and he used to love it. But he was a classic example of someone like Frank, forgive me for saying this, but he was very stiff. But he loved the practice, even though he couldn't really, he was not excelling in the practice, but he loved the practice as it was. By giving him a few props, some bolsters and blocks or whatever, strap, he was able to modify all the poses, and he was thriving in that sense, like it was giving him so much joy. So I think that is, for me, that's kind of like the future of where we need to go with all of this stuff, is just accept that we can modify, we can use props, we can add progressions, regressions, all this kind of thing.
I love that. And I love not making that whole idea into an achievable sense. Like you just talked about the joy and lifting your grandkids over your head. And like those are, maybe that didn't seem possible, but like it opened up those realms. But then when we talk about like putting your leg behind your head, like, is that, I know you guys have brought this up. Where does that fit into life experience, or how does that really help you? And then these preconceived ideas we have of age. And it's funny because when I turned 50, or in my late 50s, my kids were out of the house. Like, Mark, you have a new baby. I mean, like having I don't know if you have kids or whatever, but having a family, a young family, oh my gosh, that's like, that's really hard. I mean, that's hard. It's wonderful, and it's hard.
No sleep.
But I have nothing else to do except my garden. So like I don't have any other stressors, all those things for me are past. And so, life opens up. Well, you guys have been really tricky and slippery and very hard to so,
very hard to what?
Yeah, you guys are funny. So tricky, slippery, and hard to pin down. You would be great. You keep opening up the paradox of each, and I love that. And that's why really that I invited you here, because I sense that open-mindedness. That I was just reading Richard Freeman and Mary Taylor's new book, and it's not out yet, but I have an advanced and Richard describes a closed mind, like when you walk into an old house that hasn't been opened up in a while, right? And it's musty, and it smells, it's stank, and it's gross and stagnant, and and opening up the windows and opening up the doors and letting that fresh air in and opening up our minds. And I feel like that's what the three of you were bringing with the Mythbusters, and that's why I invited you here. And so now I'd like to ask, this is your chance. I brought up 3, but do you all have a myth or something that you would like to dispel, bring clarity around, or just discuss?
We can talk about our next post, hey guys, about the glutes in back bends. To squeeze or not to squeeze, that is still the question.
Yeah, so this is our latest offering. So that's going to drop in the next, day or so, I think, a couple of days. Yep. Because that seems to be one, and Ollie actually put a post, like a poll on the Ashtanga Home Practitioners Facebook group, and he asked, like, what are the beliefs? How many people are squeezers? How many people are soft bums? having a little bit of both. And it was
Hear this one. This is awesome.
Yeah, so it was interesting to see that breakdown, and there was variability in the answers, and then in the comment section, then there were also some really interesting comments, and so we're going to just try and just work through what the different claims are, and then talk a little bit about are these claims valid? I don't know. Are we going to do a spoiler alert here for our post?
When are you?
Yeah, we might as well, because we can hit a few things that we can't do in the post.
Yeah, we can actually talk nuance.
Yeah.
Well,
so,
okay, cool. All right.
Yeah.
Well,
you had a really good when we were writing it.
What's that?
This will probably this will probably be posted after. So.
Oh yeah, so perfect. People can follow up.
Although I may do this before, like I may give a little preview because this is good stuff.
So I mean, basically, more than 20 years ago when I started, the idea was if you squeeze your butt, the glutes are also external rotators, and that force generated by external rotation while in a bridge pose would that force would be sent up into either the sacroiliac joint or the lower back and damage those areas and cause low back pain. Okay, so that was kind of like the main thing. So it was always taught, keep the feet parallel, internally rotate the legs. Okay, external rotation, squeezing the bum is bad. Okay, and then what happened in the last, decade or more now in the fitness world was that, and I think even maybe in the physiotherapy world, there's this idea that the glutes were somehow switched off in most people, and this was the cause of back pain in the population. So then everybody started, like in the fitness world at least, doing all these like booty training with the therabands and everything around the legs, and strengthening the glutes was the answer to every back pain sort of malady. So then some of that has now started to filter into the yoga world. So there are yoga teachers who are saying, squeeze the glutes, you have to squeeze the glutes. So now it's kind of like the pendulum swinging always, like no glutes in one camp, and then the other camp is like, you have to use your glutes. Okay, so what we're trying to do is say, like, there is a spectrum, again, individual differences, and something that I always like to, like an example I would give would be like, you can do a bicep curl using your bicep, or you could turn your palm to face down. So you'd have a pronated grip, and you could do a bicep curl. It would still work, but it wouldn't be a very efficient way to do it. So the same thing in a back bend, your glutes are your main hip extensor, and we're trying to extend the hips in the back bend. You can get your hips into an extended position, say using your quads, using your hamstrings, but it's not as efficient as using the glutes to get your hips into extension. But if squeezing the glutes causes someone pain, then of course, then don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, that we're not saying that everybody has to squeeze their glutes, but we're just saying that there is, there's a nuance there, and that blanket statement, keep your bum soft, is problematic in that it's not addressing all the different people. For some people, it's going to feel better to use the glutes. Anything to add, guys?
No, perfectly described, man. That's pretty much it. And they'll see some nice visuals of Mark doing a practice and where the glutes insert is, to just get an anatomical perspective of what's actually going on. Because when you see it for yourself, you can see why we want to use a giant muscle that we've been endowed with. It's pretty helpful.
Yeah.
I think the other little thread to that was usually the explanations for why you want to keep your glutes relaxed all the time, related to it's increasing the risk of structural damage in your back if you squeeze the glutes. I mean, we know that that's not true. And so you can...
Do we know that's not true, or there's just no scientific evidence to support that? Is that right?
It's that low
so
thing.
I think it's the so because some of the myths relate to engaging the glutes, having increasing compressive forces through the back, which can then lead to disc degeneration and stuff like that. But the position of the glute, the glutes don't really attach into the lumbar spine; they attach onto the ilium. They influence anterior and posterior pelvic tilt, which can change the position of the lumbar spine. But to say, as a blanket rule, that engaging the glutes in back bends will cause damage to your back or damage your sacroiliac joint, there's no scientific evidence to support that claim, because it's like you said, it doesn't appreciate the nuance of people's different body types, and it's also a little bit of a scary sort of thing to say to people that if they engage their glutes, they're going to damage themselves. So we want to be a little bit more careful about how we use our language. So that was kind of the other thread, is sometimes those cues can be a bit nocibic. In other words, they can heighten people's fear of that. If they've got a little bit of pain in their back, oh, maybe it's because I squeezed my glutes for all those years and I've now damaged my back. Of course, I've destabilized my sacroiliac joint. Or that's another myth that we could talk about too. So it was the combination of the lack of appreciation for the individualization that we'd want to apply to yoga instruction, combined with this kind of nocibic, threatening information about the back. Does that make sense?
All right, confession time.
Okay.
Yeah.
As a major squeezer, all right, like I came to yoga, major squeezer, and I didn't start practicing yoga till I was 38, so I was a little late into the game, I guess, or early, depending on your measurement. But I was a butt squeezer, and I did have low back pain, and squeezing helped take out the low back using my glutes. And I don't know if I was squeezing like, raisin, but definitely a good firm plump, and it would help take that pain out of the low back. It also did bring my feet out to turn out just slightly as well. And over the years was told, no way, don't use it, soften it. I would hear that, not even necessarily directed at me, but would interpret it as I was doing something wrong. And this goes back really to the first when Mark said the why, what, why, and who, right? And through the years in my own experimentation, what does it feel like when it's soft? What does it feel like when I use? Realizing that it had nothing to do with that at all. Here's too much information. I had 2 C-sections. So my sensation in my low belly was low, in fact, gone. After all those years, not really realizing that I wasn't connecting with that low belly. So it was the front opening. My spine was flexible enough, but I wasn't able to open in the front part of me because I kind of lost that sensation. So it was like, it wasn't really my psoas. And through the years, I realized that, again, going back and just having to do it slowly and figure out what my body was doing, why it was doing it, how it felt, and kind of going into that experience. And what I love about the 3 of you is you keep encouraging that we can play. I think I heard you say this. We can actually experiment maybe and find out what that feels like in our bodies and explore it in our
100%.
Just on that, a friend of mine, when we were discussing these little dogmas and myths, it just came out when we were talking, and he was like, okay, be like Iyengar, not like Iyengar's method. So what he meant by that was experiment and innovate and change and explore things and just muck around and figure out what works. But then when you're trying to systematize a teaching methodology, you kind of have to write it down, and you sort of have to have some rules that are consistent, especially if you've got schools all around the world. So it becomes this like standardized thing, and then people misinterpret those rules as being like black and white. But that's like really not how he was practicing at all. He changed his practice completely over the years. And sometimes that, I mean, that's what I would consider like the traditional approach. Is tradition is innovation. Tradition isn't like small boxes, but we like to put things in boxes. I think it's easier as humans to like make things black and white sometimes. And then that gets fed through to the students. That this is the way to do it. But if we actually have a look back, you know, in time, either the way that Iyengar was mucking around with stuff, or back at the way that yoga just happens to have evolved historically, where people just trying different things, blending different movement practices and martial arts and stuff like that with yoga, and you have these warrior poses, and it was like this dynamic kind of blending, changing, evolving thing, and humans were just trying to figure out what their bodies were capable of. If it was that important to stay rigid, you would just see like no differentiation in yoga practices. It would just be exactly the same as what was written in the Hatha Pradipika. But we see all these different schools and different variations, and that's because people mucked around, they tried different things, and they weren't rigidly sticking to rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ollie, I liked your seed of truth, and I was like your sprinkles of truth, and I was thinking about my calendulas. I love calendulas, and I plant them all over in the summer. And each plant, though, it's funny because I didn't realize that they were all different. So I planted some in the main garden, some in the back garden, and some around the side. And each one of them, all the same seeds, but they all bloom differently. They all have different looks to them, and I just thought that that's kind of neat, right? So there's that consistency that you're talking about. There's those seeds of truth that we need to go find the why, you know, the seeds of wisdom, but then also allow for the flexibility and the open mind and create the experience, the individual experience, and let us bloom, you know, as we are.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well summed up.
Hey, thank you guys so much. I'm looking forward to the squeeze or not to squeeze. And thank you. I know
Yeah, cool.
different time zones for us. We're all like in different places in the
I
world.
know.
That's
Well,
it. That's it.
thanks for making it happen, Peg.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Right on. All right. Well, I'll see you guys on Instagram.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you, Peg. Bye.